seconds of my shot hit like a gunshot, a short combustible spark that announces a revolution. But what if I told you those 6 seconds almost sounded completely different? What if the opening that every fan hums, the heartbeat that summons the cast onto the stage, was nearly erased, rewritten, or buried in a drawer because it didn't fit the story Lin-Manuel Miranda ultimately wanted to tell? Tonight, we are not tracing the polished, Broadway-ready anthem everyone knows. We are peering into the attic of drafts and demos where Miranda wrestled with tone, tempo, and truth. There are versions of My Shot where the urgency is rawer, where political barbs are sharper, and where lines that cut too close to the bone were quietly struck out. There are tapes recorded at 2 in the morning, ideas scribbled frantically on napkins, and verses that vanished not because they were bad, but because they revealed something the creator was not ready to expose. Why did Miranda choose to bury certain lines? What did he protect by erasing them? Himself, his subjects, or the audience's chance to see Alexander Hamilton as something else? In this video, we will follow the ghost drafts of My Shot, listen to what almost was, and ask a single urgent question. Which lost lines might have changed Hamilton forever? Lin-Manuel Miranda stands at the center of this story, not simply as the creator of Hamilton, but as the restless architect behind every beat, breath, and bar of My Shot. Before the world hailed him as the artist who reinvented Broadway, he was a writer obsessed with precision, a composer who treated every lyric as a window into a character's soul. And in the case of Alexander Hamilton, that responsibility weighed heavier than most people realize. Miranda's reputation surged long before Hamilton opened its doors. In the wake of In the Heights, he was recognized as a new voice in American theater, one that blended hip-hop, history, and storytelling with an intimacy that felt both modern and ancestral. But success did not soften his approach. If anything, it sharpened it. When he began shaping Hamilton, he approached it not as a playwright polishing scenes, but as a historian unearthing a life, sentence by sentence, until the emotional truth aligned with the musical one. My Shot became the spine of this character study. It was the moment where Hamilton's ambition, fear, and explosive intensity converged into song. Yet it was also the piece Miranda struggled with the most. To introduce Alexander Hamilton to the world, his hunger, his defiance, his refusal to wait for permission, Miranda had to confront which parts of the man he wanted to reveal and which parts he needed to shield. This tension between character and creator explains why drafts of My Shot felt more like confessions than compositions. The drama we uncovered in the opening, the erased lines, the hidden versions, traces directly back to Miranda himself, the writer determined to get this introduction perfect, even if it meant discarding verses he had spent months shaping. For him, My Shot wasn't just a song. It was Hamilton's heartbeat, and he was willing to rewrite it as many times as necessary until that heartbeat felt unmistakably alive. Before the world knew him as the force behind Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda was simply a kid growing up in northern Manhattan, living between cultures, rhythms, and stories that would one day weave themselves into his art. Washington Heights wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a symphony of languages and identities overlapping on every block. In that environment, Miranda learned early what it meant to listen closely. To people, to music, to history whispering beneath the surface of everyday life. His parents shaped that sensibility. His mother, a clinical psychologist, carried an instinctive understanding of emotion and human behavior. His father, a political strategist deeply connected to Puerto Rican advocacy, introduced him to real-world narratives of struggle, ambition, and perseverance. In their household, conversations moved quickly from music to politics to the inner complexity of people, and Lin absorbed all of it with the curiosity of someone who knew stories could move the world. But childhood was not without its tensions. Miranda often described himself as introverted, almost shy, seeking refuge in writing when speaking felt too vulnerable. He filled notebooks with ideas, sketches, and lyrics, not because he expected anyone to read them, but because the act of writing helped him process the unpredictable world around him. Hip-hop entered his life early, and it struck him with the force of a revelation. Here was a genre where language wasn't merely sung, it was weaponized, molded, pushed to its limit. It matched the energy he felt internally, yet struggled to express externally. One of the lesser-known influences from his childhood was the way he clung to moments of ambition, not his own, but others. He admired strivers, people who came from little yet fought for everything. He read biographies, fixated on those who refused to wait for opportunity and instead created their own. Long before Alexander Hamilton entered his imagination, Miranda gravitated toward figures who carried a kind of righteous urgency, the same urgency that would later pulse through his writing. A defining moment occurred during his teenage years when he discovered cast recordings of classic musicals. Unlike most listeners who accepted the story as presented, Miranda dissected them like a scientist. He studied the logic behind melody choices, the intention behind a line, the reason a character would sing rather than speak. He wasn't just consuming art, he was decoding it. This private ritual, taking apart the structure of a song until its emotional core was exposed, became one of the habits that shaped him into the meticulous writer he is today. Another detail from his youth, often overlooked, was how deeply he felt the weight of representation. Growing up Latino in a landscape dominated by narratives far different from his own, he was acutely aware of the gaps in storytelling. He knew entire communities lived full, gripping, sprawling lives that mainstream art rarely acknowledged. This awareness would later fuel the determination behind In the Heights and ripple into the approach he took with Hamilton. Even though the founding fathers came from a vastly different world, Miranda approached their stories the same way he approached his own communities, with an insistence that complexity and humanity deserved to be shown, not simplified. All of these threads from his early life, the intellectual household, the multicultural environment, the shy observer's gaze, the obsession with lyrical precision, the fascination with ambition, converged into the artist who would one day wrestle with My Shot. The song's intensity, its urgency, its defiance, didn't emerge from nowhere. They were echoes of the boy who learned early that words could be both sanctuary and power, and that the right sentence, placed in the right moment, could change everything. When Lin-Manuel Miranda stepped beyond the boundaries of his childhood neighborhood and into the world of professional theater, he did not arrive with the polish of a seasoned playwright. He arrived with a backpack full of notebooks, a restless mind, and a creative hunger that refused to quiet down. His early steps were marked by improvisation groups, late-night writing sessions, and the kind of trial-and-error process that only artists who haven't yet been told, "You can't do that," allow themselves to explore. At Wesleyan University, Miranda found the environment that first allowed him to test the limits of his imagination. Surrounded by people who treated creativity as oxygen, he began staging small projects, sketches, musical fragments, experimental scenes that blended humor with musicality. The seeds of his future work were visible even then. Rhythmic dialogue, characters who used melody to reveal deeper parts of themselves, and an instinctive pull toward stories of overlooked or underestimated individuals. It was at Wesleyan that he started writing In the Heights, the musical that would eventually bring him into the spotlight. But its early stages were far from glamorous. The first version premiered at the university's student theater, rough around the edges, emotionally charged, and full of the promise of something that could grow into more. Miranda poured everything into it. The music drew from salsa, hip-hop, Broadway, reggaeton, all woven together with an ease that made people sit up and pay attention. It wasn't just the sound that felt new, it was the intention. Here was a young writer insisting that his community, his culture, and his complicated world deserved to stand center stage. The journey from that student production to Broadway success was long, marked by rewrites, workshops, and moments of doubt. Yet every revision taught Miranda something essential about narrative clarity, character motivation, and the emotional precision required to sustain a musical. By the time In the Heights finally reached Broadway and earned him widespread acclaim, Miranda had honed the discipline that would guide his later work. The relentless belief that a song must earn its place, and that every line must carry both weight and truth. During this period, a new fascination was quietly forming in Miranda's mind, the story of Alexander Hamilton. The spark came unexpectedly when he picked up Ron Chernow's biography for a vacation read. Within a few chapters, he recognized a rhythm in Hamilton's life, a cadence that felt uncannily like hip-hop. Instead of a traditional rise-and-fall historical figure, Hamilton came across as a lyrical force of nature, brilliant, chaotic, impatient, and propelled by a desperation that seemed familiar to Miranda himself. He began experimenting with the idea almost immediately. Small sketches, early lyrics, a spoken-word style retelling of Hamilton's origins, and then the first attempts at what would become My Shot. Miranda sensed instinctively that the song would be the gravitational center of the entire show. The moment where Hamilton steps forward fully formed, declaring his ambitions without apology. But reaching that moment required navigating a maze of drafts, each one intense but imperfect. While working on Hamilton, Miranda was balancing multiple creative demands, acting commitments, composing for other projects, and maintaining the momentum from In the Heights. Yet Hamilton was different. It demanded something deeper. The level of research mirrored the rigor of a historian, while the level of emotional authenticity required the vulnerability of a memoirist. Miranda found himself writing in hotel rooms, backstage corners, cramped airplane seats, anywhere inspiration struck or a particular line refused to resolve itself. The artistic challenges were immense. Miranda wasn't simply writing songs, he was constructing an entire world. Each character needed a unique musical identity. Burr's calm restraint, Lawrence's idealistic fire, Lafayette's linguistic acrobatics, and Hamilton's relentless intensity. Crafting this musical palette meant endless experimentation. A verse shifted here, a rhyme tightened there, a metaphor swapped out for something sharper, truer, more historically grounded. My Shot became the ultimate test of this process. Miranda worked on it for over a year, and its evolution mirrored the growth of the entire show. Early versions were more aggressive, some were more politically charged, others were quieter, introspective, closer to spoken confession than declaration. He wanted the song to capture Hamilton's hunger without overshadowing the complexity of his internal conflicts. Every adjustment reflected questions Miranda asked himself again and again. What is Hamilton fighting for? What does he fear? And how does he want the world to see him? Key influences also shaped Miranda during this period. Artists like Rakim, Big Pun, and Eminem inspired the density of internal rhymes in My Shot. Musical legends like Sondheim pushed him to refine lyrical economy and thematic coherence. Chernow's biography grounded the narrative in fact. His collaborators, actors, musicians, directors, sparked conversations that helped Miranda discover angles he hadn't initially considered. The trials came alongside triumphs. There were moments when the project felt too big, when revisions seemed endless, when expectations, from fans of In the Heights, from his own high standards, pressed heavily onto the page. But every challenge fed into the discipline that defined his artistic journey. Slowly, patiently, the musical skeleton of Hamilton took shape, with My Shot pulsing at its center like a heartbeat finally finding its rhythm. By the time Hamilton's score began to solidify, Miranda had evolved not just as a composer, but as a storyteller capable of translating history into a living emotional landscape. It was this transformation, shaped by years of learning, refining, and daring to reimagine the boundaries of musical theater, that led him to confront the question that would define the next chapter. Which version of My Shot truly captured the soul of Alexander Hamilton? The breaking point came when Miranda realized that My Shot had grown far beyond a simple character introduction. It had become a confession, one that mirrored Hamilton so closely that parts of it felt uncomfortably personal. Early drafts carried a sharper edge, with verses that cut deeper into themes of class, identity, and the volatile hunger to rise above obscurity. Some lines were fearless to the point of vulnerability. Others were raw, almost confrontational. In these abandoned versions, Hamilton wasn't just ambitious. He was dangerous, unpredictable, and at times brutally self-aware. During one late-night writing session, Miranda recorded a demo that would later become infamous among those who heard it. His voice, quiet at first, built steadily into a strained intensity. The lyrics revealed a Hamilton whose ambition bordered on desperation, whose political rage flared hotter than it ever would in the final show. When he played the demo back the next morning, something inside him recoiled. Not because the writing was weak, but because it was too honest. It exposed the fragile line between the character he was creating and the creator he was becoming. This was the moment everything shifted. Miranda began to question whether the rawness he poured into early versions of My Shot threatened to unbalance the entire show. If Hamilton's first declaration was too incendiary, the story's emotional arc would peak too early. If the lyrics revealed too much darkness too soon, the audience might struggle to empathize with the man they were meeting for the first time. And if the political undertones hit harder than intended, the musical risked feeling didactic rather than human. But beneath these artistic concerns was something more delicate, a realization that the early drafts were exposing parts of his own psyche that he wasn't ready to place under theatrical lights. In some of the lost lines, Hamilton's voice blended with Miranda's. The immigrant child who felt the weight of expectation, the artist afraid of wasting his one chance, the man balancing ambition with the fear of overreaching. The more he revised, the more he recognized that the boundary between writer and character had blurred in ways he hadn't anticipated. The turning point crystallized during a workshop session when Miranda performed one of the earlier versions of My Shot in front of a small group of collaborators. The room fell silent when he finished, not out of awe, but out of uncertainty. It was powerful, yes, but it was also overwhelming. One collaborator gently suggested that Hamilton felt too fully formed, leaving little space for growth. Another noted that the political language risked overshadowing the emotional core of the show. Miranda understood instantly what they were pointing toward. The song was brilliant, but it didn't belong to the musical he was building. It belonged to a different project, one he wasn't writing. The realization hit harder than expected. To fix the song, he needed to dismantle it. To capture Hamilton truthfully, he had to silence parts of himself that had crept into the draft. It required a level of restraint that felt almost painful. The verses he had lived with for months, the ones that had carried him through sleepless nights, the ones that reflected his innermost fears, would have to go. This decision marked the definitive turning point. Miranda returned to the song with a new mindset, clarity over catharsis, story over self-expression. He stripped out the lines that revealed too much, softened the edges that cut too sharply, and reshaped Hamilton's voice so that it carried urgency without overshadowing the narrative to come. It was an act of creative sacrifice, one that quietly changed the DNA of the musical. Yet those erased lines, those lost versions, remained a shadow presence. They lingered in notebooks, in voice memos, in the memories of early workshop sessions. And it is in this tension, between what was written and what was hidden, that the true drama of My Shot reveals itself. The real reason behind the vanished lines of My Shot is rooted in a truth Miranda rarely says aloud. The early versions of the song revealed more about him than about Hamilton. While the musical is built from historical research, My Shot was the one place where Miranda allowed himself to step inside the character so deeply that their voices intertwined. And when those voices began echoing each other too closely, he knew something had to change. In interviews, Miranda hinted at this when he described the initial drafts as too unfiltered, as if the lyrics carried a charge that didn't serve the story, but instead exposed the emotional state of the writer. He admitted that some lines should never see the light of day, not because they were flawed, but because they felt like diary entries disguised as verse. They captured ambition sharpened by insecurity, pride shadowed by fear, and a kind of immigrant drive that bordered on obsession. These were truths Miranda recognized in himself, and translating them directly into Hamilton would distort the narrative into something more personal than historical. Another part of the explanation lies in the musical architecture of the show. My Shot had to set the emotional groundwork for Hamilton's journey, but if the song revealed too much too soon, the rest of the musical would lose its dramatic progression. Hamilton is meant to grow, stumble, rise, and break. An early version of him that is already volatile, politically explosive, or emotionally exposed would collapse the arc. Miranda realized that the character's intensity needed to build gradually, not erupt fully formed in the opening act. There was also a deeper cultural layer at play. Miranda felt a responsibility to portray Hamilton as both heroic and flawed, but not as a caricature of ambition. Some early lines leaned too heavily into a darker, angrier tone, a tone that risked overshadowing the humanity of the character. By softening and refining the lyrics, Miranda created room for the audience to empathize before confronting Hamilton's contradictions later in the show. Ultimately, the true reason the lost lines disappeared is a blend of artistic discipline and emotional self-preservation. Miranda wasn't hiding mistakes. He was protecting the integrity of the musical and, in a quiet way, protecting himself. The final version of My Shot strikes a careful balance, fierce enough to reveal Hamilton's hunger, but measured enough to serve the arc of the story rather than the inner monologue of its creator. And so those earlier drafts remained in the shadows, not because they lacked brilliance, but because the truth they carried belonged not to Alexander Hamilton, but to Lin-Manuel Miranda himself. Today, Lin-Manuel Miranda stands as one of the most influential storytellers of his generation, a figure whose work has altered the landscape of American theater in ways few could have predicted. Since Hamilton's debut, he has stepped into a different phase of his creative life, one shaped not by the hunger to break through, but by the responsibility of having redefined what musical theater can be. And yet, even as his career expands across film, stage, and global cultural influence, the echoes of My Shot continue to follow him. Professionally, Miranda has branched far beyond Broadway. He has written for Disney, composed for animated films, directed feature projects, produced new works, and advocated for arts education and Puerto Rican relief efforts. Each endeavor carries traces of the same creative DNA, a belief in the power of narrative, a reverence for underrepresented voices, and an insistence that music can do more than entertain. It can reveal, uplift, and connect. But with every project, Hamilton remains the gravitational center of his artistic universe, the work that marked not only a career milestone, but a cultural shift. What is striking about Miranda's current position is the way he balances his public identity with a growing sense of introspection. He often speaks about the pressure of having created something as monumental as Hamilton, describing it not as a burden, but as a responsibility to keep honoring the craft. The ambition that once drove the early, unfiltered drafts of My Shot has matured into something steadier, a commitment to thoughtful creation rather than relentless output. In interviews, he reflects on the importance of patience, revision, and restraint, lessons learned through the long, complicated journey of shaping Hamilton's score. As for his legacy, it now stretches beyond accolades, awards, and box office success. His work has opened pathways for new artists, expanded the boundaries of who belongs on major stages, and redefined how American history can be told. He has shown that hip-hop can coexist with historical narrative, that immigrant stories can stand at the center of national mythology, and that art can bridge eras without losing authenticity. The influence of Hamilton can be felt in classrooms, in political conversations, in the renewed interest in American founding narratives, and in the countless young creators who cite Miranda as the spark that ignited their own artistic ambitions. Yet what might be most enduring is the quieter part of his legacy. The understanding that revision is not an act of weakness, but of artistry. The lost lines of "My Shot," the drafts hidden away, the versions that never reached the stage, all reflect an artist who knew when to let go, when to reshape, and when to trust silence more than sound. It is this discipline that continues to guide his work today. The world may know the polished version of "My Shot," but Miranda carries all its earlier shadows within him, reminders of the journey that shaped not only a song but the artist himself. In the end, the story of "My Shot" is not simply the story of a song. It is the story of an artist learning when to speak boldly and when to step back, when to push forward and when to let silence do its work. The polished version we know, explosive, courageous, unforgettable, is only one layer. Beneath it lie years of searching, reshaping, questioning, and choosing which truths deserve to stand in the light. What remains most powerful is the understanding that creativity isn't born from certainty, but from struggle. Miranda's journey reminds us that greatness is rarely the result of the first attempt. It comes from the willingness to rewrite, to fail, to face the parts of ourselves we are not ready to make public, and to trust that what stays hidden still shapes what the world ultimately sees. The discarded lines of "My Shot" were never mistakes. They were stepping stones, necessary fragments that guided him toward the version that would move millions. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson behind all of this. Every one of us carries drafts of ourselves we keep tucked away, the fears we outgrow, the ambitions we refine, the versions we choose not to share. But those hidden parts still matter. They shape our voice, our choices, our story, just as they shaped Miranda's. As we close this chapter, remember that Hamilton's anthem isn't only about seizing opportunity. It's about becoming the person who is ready to seize it, through work, doubt, resilience, and the courage to start again. If there is something you have been shaping, revising, or hiding for fear it isn't perfect yet, maybe this is your reminder that every great story begins in draft form. If you want to keep exploring the untold histories, the hidden verses, and the secret journeys behind the music that shaped a generation, there are many more stories waiting just beyond this one. Thank you for watching.